Hey YouTube, so this is just a really small micro video on natural tinder sources. I thought about actually, showing every one of these sources and blah blah. It's just common sense though, but I'm just gonna go through a few of them, and this is just stuff that you could find out in the wild in various parts of the United States. This is nothing crazy or amazing, but nonetheless, though, it just kind of reminds you that sometimes you don't need to go out and buy all this man-made, put together tinder and processed tinder is what I was trying to think of. You don't have to do all that. You can simply just look around and find, the stuff that's already there. You don't have to kind of reinvent the wheel here. So natural tinder sources. I love bark, especially from dry trees, like birch bark and bark. Bark is great, man. Especially if you can get some sap on that bark. Man, sap's great. You can call it, resin, whatever you want to call it. Good stuff. Wood shavings. If you have a dry piece of wood, you can take the back end. If you have a nice 90-degree edge on the spine of your blade, you can just scrape off, man, some bark shavings. Of course, some people call that scrapings versus shavings. So that would be the next thing, would be shavings. So the shavings is going to be taking the blade itself and actually drawing down, probably more like feather sticking and stuff like that. I would imagine would be considered the shaving part of it. Now, the next thing would be leaves. Definitely want dry leaves. You kind of have to try to be careful. In certain environments, the dampness and so forth can make those a little bit less flammable. Just like pine cones, if you have to get them nice and dry, try to get as much pine sap on those pine cones, and also pine needles. They can work if they're really dry and they have a bit of sap on them. Now, cattails. The cattail down on the top of the head of the tail. It's not so much all year round, but a good portion of the year you can find that. Of course, if you're around lakes and ponds and stuff like that, some streams that might have that. If you live in an area that supports cattail. Also, you have natural cotton. Now, of course, lots of places up north don't have cotton fields, but maybe if you're in the south, you might actually find natural cotton. Some places it's a little bit easier than others, so that could be a possible option. Another thing could be animal hair. People don't really think about this too much, but not that you're going to run into a lot of carcasses when you're out in the woods, but we're talking about maybe like tufts of fur, maybe that was stuck on a tree. Maybe that an animal is rubbing up against it like a deer, or maybe you've run into a bird that's just passed away. These things could be used, to fluff up and to use the down on the animal to use as a tinder. And then of course you got the fat woods and pines and stuff. All this impregnated resin types of woods that work really good. And so you can never get enough of that. And then lastly, you have grass. I almost forget about this one sometimes. Dried grass, and you can just gather it, especially if it's still upright in the vertical position. It's not down and damp. You can just grab and cut off a big old hunk of it, and you can even take your hands and rough it up and get more surface area, or take the back end of your knife if you have a pommel. And maybe just pound on it a little bit and try to break up the fibers, and once again to create a more surface area for the flame to catch. And you can make these tinder bundles out of a lot of these sources of tinder that I've spoken about, and make a little nest. And so if you're doing something like maybe a bow drill, you can put your coals in there, and or if you have a fire source, maybe you have a lighter. I mean, it's even that easier, and you just want to catch something on fire, you could just drop that item while it's still going and into a little tinder nest or tinder bundle, and catch that bundle on fire, and then place that bundle into maybe like a teepee or whatever structure of fire structure you have to get that going. So as always, thanks for watching. And so this should be somewhat helpful, I think, for the very beginner, that when you're trying to figure out, when you're out and about and you're doing like maybe like a 2 or 3 day type of camping or hiking adventure, when you're doing your actual the actual hike itself and you're moving toward your destination or moving toward the campsite, and you come across any of these things that I just spoke about for your natural tinder, I always keep a little pouch, or at least an open pocket that is empty. And so when I find these tinders, I can just kind of grab them on the way. And by the time sometimes I get to my campsite, I already have 3 or 4 different types of tinders, and maybe a good handful of each. So if one doesn't work so well, maybe one's a little bit more damp than I thought, or maybe one of them just doesn't have a lot of pine resin or whatever, I can toss that, and then I have other ones. So that's one little trick, though, is when you're on your way and moving about and you're mobile and you have access at the moment, go ahead and take advantage. It just takes a few seconds just to grab it up, especially if the bark's already coming off the tree. You don't want to damage any trees and do any damage to any of the natural, ambiance. But at the same time, if there's a down tree and it's super dry and you got maybe punk wood, for example, and it's falling apart, or you can definitely see that there's a down, like maybe a pine tree, and there's like big old hunks of sap and resin on the side and dried bark. I mean, man, you may even want to bring an extra, like maybe a Ziploc bag, just if there's a lot of resin that so it won't stick to inside your jacket. But anyways, these are just ideas. Hope this helps the very new, the beginner, trying to understand what the heck's all this fire tinder stuff's all about, especially in the natural tinder and the natural world, and what it offers us humans in ways of making fire, so we can cook and have warmth and give us a sense of security and enjoy our nights. So we don't have to we don't have that the isolation, that darkness that we all pretty much don't like. There's a lot of good psychological things from having a campfire. So as always, you guys take care, and I'll catch you real soon.